Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk Show with Waylon Lewis, coming to you live, or not live, as I always like to say, if you're watching the recorded version from Boulder, Colorado. And today I am honored, I'm honored, but I'm more just happy to have my old young professor, Askold Melnyczuk. Askold, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to speak with you again, Waylon, after all these years.
Yeah, it's been, I think, 20 years, and you don't look a day older.
You know, good lie to begin with. Let's get more honest now.
Let's just keep lying to each other, because I'm sure I don't look a day older. Yeah. So Askold, aside from, being my professor, has done a few things, like being a novelist that who has won every award ever. And I was just saying, you're great when you're being featured in the New York Times and they're deigning to give you critical feedback. I feel like that's the greatest honor for any novelist, is when the New York Times is saying, well, we really preferred the first two books. This one is, is interesting world, being a famous novelist.
They're always complaining. They're always complaining.
Yeah.
Never lose them.
Never happy.
Critics.
They just want more.
Critics. What can you say?
Yeah. So before we get too into it, we begin these conversations with a bow of mutual respect, which will be no problem from my end. Askold, you'll have to work hard on your bow to extend me some respect. So basically, just take a good posture, which means upright but also relaxed, not rigid. And viewers, you can do this too. Offer a bow of mutual respect, to Askold, and also this is a reminder of your own mission in your own life. So you can kind of ground your butt, kind of connect with the principle of the earth, realm of details, solidity, but a nurturing stability. And then your head with the heavens above, that's realm of inspiration, ideas, vision, mission. And then join the two in your heart, which is the realm of friendship, and give it away. And then we begin also with meditating for about 30 minutes. Just kidding. Just about 45 seconds. So if you want to keep your good posture, everyone can join in watching. Just you can keep your eyes open. Look down about 6 feet in front of you. If you have, if you can look at the ground or whatever's in front of you, just down a bit. Your eyes don't have to be open, but in this particular meditation practice, they are. And just find your breath in and out. And keep your attention on your breath. It doesn't have to be a tight attention. It can be a relaxed attention. In and out. Then if you find your thoughts, your mind wandering off, if you're thinking about breakfast or lunch or an argument you had or something you need to do or an itch, whatever it is, a noise, doesn't matter, good or bad, happy or sad, any thoughts, you can just acknowledge silently to yourself, I'm thinking. Say the word thinking silently to yourself and bring your attention back to your out-breath. You can just let the in-breath naturally occur. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a lovely meditation. Good to be grounded in Ayana.
Yeah. Yeah, I always, we started doing it actually with every single guest, and obviously most of our guests are not Buddhist, or most don't have a meditation practice, but everyone appreciates we started doing it actually with a busy, harried entrepreneur, and she said at the end of the conversation, it was a great, fun conversation. The only thing I regretted was it took me about, she was saying, about half an hour to kind of slow down from the day. So,
Yeah, sure, of course,
yeah.
of course. It's something I'm always longing to do with students in classes at UMass, but always feel like might be a little bit intrusive.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it is. It is sort of a weird thing to do nothing for a few moments, you know?
To loaf and invite your soul, Whitman said. I think that's always a wise thing to do.
What did you say?
To loaf and invite your soul.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
To loaf and invite your soul. I love that. Yeah, I mean, it is such a human thing just to kind of get out of our busy. I know for myself, I always have so many fears and to-do lists and anxieties and ambition,
Yeah.
happinesses, whatever it is. Yeah.
And right, all the psychotic spaces the mind enters into when it's just left to race off on its own. Yeah.
So let's begin. I love writing, and as we discussed briefly before the video began, I'm not very good at finishing any writing I do. You've actually finished books. How do you bring sort of mindfulness, whatever that means, to the practice of writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great and huge question. There are so many aspects to any discipline. And we were also talking briefly about the relationship between meditation and writing. I know that in terms of finishing, it's actually remarkable to remember, also very useful to remember that this is really your call. No one can stop you from this. It's the one thing that you have, for sure, can decide to do until it's done. And at the same time, books have their time. My first book took me 12 years to finish.
Wow.
And that's not unusual. I remember reading a study somewhere saying that, in fact, the average length of time for the first book is about 10 years. So I was slow. And it's nothing to be proud of, but it's nothing to be ashamed of either. There seems to be just a rhythm to the process.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, what you remind yourself every day is that what you want to be doing is pursuing this discipline and this craft, right? And this is a discipline like meditation is a discipline, like boxing is a discipline, like playing a cornet is a discipline. Mm-hmm. And every musician I'm sure that you've ever talked to has talked about how quickly they notice when they haven't practiced for a day, how quickly the audience notices when they haven't practiced for a week. It's it's kind of like that with writing for me. It's not like that for everybody. I know poets who write only in October, for instance.
Huh.
And that's the joy of poetry, I think, the freedom of it.
Right. Yeah, the joy of poetry is you can be rusty or really good at it, and nobody understands you either way half the time, right?
Yeah. That's sometimes the way, and at the same time, there's also there's the school of that I know you're intimately familiar with, Ginsberg's school of first thought, best thought, and then there's the school of infinite revision.
Right. Yeah.
Yeats saying no poem is ever finished, only abandoned.
Wow. Yeah, and Hemingway, I mean, not poetry, but Hemingway, kind of in his macho, manly way, bragging about, not even bragging, just saying, I edited the last page of For Whom the Bell Tolls 900 times, or whatever he said.
Well, those pages, the ending, the drafts of those pages are actually in the Hemingway, in the John F. Kennedy Library, in the Hemingway collection right across from where I teach now at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And those drafts have been on display, and you really said, I've forgotten how many times it was that he redid it. But yeah, he kind of did it over and over. So tell me a little bit about where a book gets your interest and where you lose interest in it. Or is it you get excited about another topic and move on?
You mean in terms of my writing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you meant in terms of my reading, and I was going to say I read mostly biographies, so I'm learning something, and then I have to say, like a lot of like Raymond Chandler kind of stuff, like,
Sure.
Just stuff that's really easy to be hooked on, even if you're reading 2 paragraphs a day.
Yeah, well, what you said is interesting about reading biography. I love biographies. I love history. I do a lot of research for some of the novels that I've written.
Yeah.
But at the same time, for me, fiction is, to quote John Gardner, kind of an ancient mode of thought. And so I feel like I learn from fiction and I think through fiction in a way that I can't when I'm writing nonfiction or poetry. There's a way in which,
Yeah.
that line of Emily Dickinson's, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant."
Yeah.
There's a freedom in the indirectness and in the disguises and masks
Yeah.
that fiction permits you.
I've been quoting that Emily Dickinson line for 20 years, I think. I'm not sure about that.
Well, again, another sign of the wisdom there.
Yeah. So yeah, I just want to give a shout out, just to be clear, like, you're on the show not just because you're an award-winning novelist and all that, but for a much simpler reason, really, that you were, for many of us, and certainly for me, the embodiment of a teacher who communicated joy and in delight in discovery of reading and in writing. And I remember just being, I always say, when people are asking who you were when you were coming up on the schedule, I was saying, well, on all these awards and la la la, I don't know, but he's to me, he's sort of like the Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society, who gave us a joy in learning, and that's the highest honor, or whatever it is, of a teacher.
Thanks. And that'll be about enough of that. Thank you, Waylon.
Yeah, and I knew you wouldn't want to hear that, but
of course, I deeply appreciate that, and just like back at you, that of course the delight of teaching comes from the exchange you have with the people in the room, and the sort of astonishing range of experiences that are always around us when we meet with other beings, human or otherwise.
Yeah.
So it's like an amazing atmosphere to be in a classroom.
And you also, I mean, aside from teaching and writing, you also created this literary journal that has how many years has it been around now? 30 or
40, or a little over 40 now. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's its 40th anniversary a year or two ago. So yeah, a long time.
Right.
Go ahead, make me feel even older.
Yeah, well, I just turned 40, so I would actually say 40 is not a long time. 40 is just very brief, and feel very young. So Agni is very young. So what do you spend your days? I understand you're married now. I don't think when I knew you, you were.
No.
How do you spend your days? Like writing, teaching?
Yeah, writing is a nearly daily discipline. These days, in between teaching and married life and writing, there's also elder care. It's a big part of my life. A couple of years ago, moved my 90-plus-year-old parents up to Medford, and I'm really kind of learning an awful lot from what it's like to be facing physical limitations in a way that you haven't since you were a child.
Yeah.
It's quite fascinating. My mother has what we call forgetfulness, and what other doctors have another term for, which we kind of avoid. And it's just so interesting to be in the presence of a mind and that state. Not always a delight, but then I'm sure it's not always a delight for them. So. Right. But always absorbing. So yeah, but writing is a constant. Writing is a constant, as it needs to be. In a lot of ways, I mean, it's interesting. The one thing I really want to talk to you about is the relationship between writing and meditation. Because do you, for instance, write first thing, or do you write at the end of the day? When do you kind of get down to your work?
Well, I sort of live the life. My life is kind of the life of an entrepreneur. So from the moment I wake up, I have a very full Google Calendar of meetings and this and that. Right. And when there's any gaps, I push things into it, or other people push things into it, and I enjoy it. So it's not a complaint. Sure. I've created it, that kind of life for myself. And when I have gaps, being in Boulder, you legally have to either run, cycle, climb, do yoga, or something every day. Hike with your dog. So I'm always trying to exercise and kind of stay healthy and de-stress when I have gaps. And
right.
So like for an hour this morning, or 45 minutes, I edited this book that I'm finally
Right.
I finally completed, and now I'm editing or
Great.
re-editing.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to send it to you. Actually, I think I'm really
Tell me
there's
about
this
it.
tension. What's that?
Tell me a little bit about it. A series of essays?
No, it's so I've written. I love just listening to you talk about fiction because I've always really enjoyed, as Emily Dickinson said, telling the truth but telling it slantways. I've really enjoyed sort of autobiographical fiction, kind of like Kerouac, but slightly, the names are changed and all that, but basically my life. And then I started kind of accidentally, actually. I just wrote, I think about a year or two ago, I think it's actually been 2 years now, I've been working on this book. I saw this beautiful music video that it was a beautiful song, very emotional song, without being too kind of saccharine. And it was very sad, and it showed these lovers going off, leaving the city and going to the country and just spending a weekend together in this cabin. And at the same time, I think I was probably breaking up with someone or falling in love with someone. These things came together, and I just wrote this very simple, kind of slightly fictitious, but not quite present tense, but basically my experience. I just wrote about my experience, really, quite directly, but it wasn't really about anyone or anything.
Right.
And it was called Things I Would Like to Do With You in the Woods.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost a little bit poetic, and maybe a bit cliche, which has been sort of the tension of writing this, is getting a lot of detail in it, but also letting it. I love that you quoted Whitman, because he's one of my favorite.
Sure.
He's everyone's favorites, really.
One of the great American spirits, one of the great world spirits.
Yeah. So, he wrote so simply and so iconically and so powerfully, but it never felt cliche or trite.
Sure. But he was also working, with kind of very powerful, deliberate rhetorical devices, right? I mean, he said that, right, that he was influenced by Italian opera and arias.
Huh.
And
well, I
so
didn't know that.
he would have these kind of, and also by the Old Testament, right? So he'd have these long lists and catalogs,
Right.
which are actually conventional poetic devices. So he was a savvy guy.
Yeah, so that's sort of what I've come back to. It's funny, I got lucky. I think I tripped into this rhetorical device that maybe I would have discovered 10 years earlier if I had kept studying with you, but where I just will often say I would like to in almost every chapter.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's really just about my I think it's about being my age and being very busy and always very tired and kind of burned out, but loving what I do, and just wanting to kind of fall in love and wanting to rest.
Yes. Do you think love is rest?
Yeah. Well, that's why it's fiction, right?
Right.
Science fiction. Yeah, it's the new kind of love we're inventing in the future.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
It'll never happen. That's why people like to read about it. It's fantasy. And yeah. And so go ahead.
Well, so it's interesting. I think every writer has different goals and aims for what they think fiction should do, and I think one of fiction's highest goals is to disillusion people. And that may sound very negative, but in fact, what's more valuable than getting rid of your illusions and having some closer contact with what is there and what is real? To me, that's very similar to the goal of meditation. It's a way of making contact with what is actually there rather than what is racing through your head only.
I love that you say that, because there's this tension for me, and I'm relatively unguided. I don't really have the company of writers or teachers here particularly.
By choice, clearly.
There's this tension between that sort of fantasy that we're joking about and that there's some element of being, like in Buddhism, they call it losing heart. Trungpa Rinpoche called it losing heart, and in the very Buddhist fashion, he meant it as a positive thing. When you finally, your ego kind of loses heart, and you finally kind of give up on your illusions.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that's a lovely analogy. There is that surrender to something else. There's so many different ways of putting it. I mean, there's the whole Buddhist vocabulary for it, which I found so tremendously useful and helpful in many areas of my life. But it's not the only vocabulary for describing this. There's a great kind of a Polish writer, Witold Gombrowicz, who kept a diary while he was in exile in Argentina. And the diary, he kind of did a little parody of the diary that goes Monday, me, Tuesday, me, Wednesday, me, goes through the days of the week. And Sunday, he goes, finally something else.
Uh-huh.
And, it's that kind of surrender to that something else, whether it be the story, whether it be your character, that begins to allow another process to take over in you, at least as far as writing goes. And I think a lot of analogies to meditation. There's another kind of line that I love from the poet Howard Nemerov, who said that he writes a poem not to say what he thinks, not even to find out what he thinks, but to find out what the poem thinks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Buddhism, there's a thing called terma. Have you heard of terma?
I'm thinking of termas as the things those nuggets of wisdom that are buried and that are found and rediscovered. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so there's a physical terma, like treasure, like
Right.
teachings that might be buried
Right.
when some teacher escaped Tibet or something. But then there's mind terma, which is that process that you find in sports or in writing or anything, where they say it wasn't me, it was just I
Right.
connected with something else. It was that Sunday. Finally, it wasn't me.
Right. But you had to make yourself available to it. You had to be there. You had to be there on the cushion or in the chair.
But the contradiction, which is so interesting, I mean, I'm sure you find this in your own writing, is that you also need to be deeply personal and genuine and not sort of that cliche fantasy thing.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and it's partly because we read in order to get privileged glimpses into other worlds and other lives. In fact, we read for that something else, right? Because we want to get outside of our own experience and see what somebody else's is like and kind of compare notes as kind of travelers on this in this curious place. And so the notes that you have to offer are going to be very much contingent on what you have experienced through your body and then filtered through your singular imagination, and the way in which is really, imagination, I think, is just the way we combine different images, and that's going to be different for every temperament. And so a lot of ways, I think that, I often worry when writers talk about they're writing in cliches, because I wonder whether that's really true, whether that's just the way it feels to you because you're so familiar with your experience.
That's pretty perceptive. I think, you can write something quite genuinely, and then you can look back at it and judge it when you're not in that state of mind.
Right.
That's why, whoever it is you quoted said it's who was it? It's not
Nemerov, I think. Yeah.
You're never done editing. You just
Yates.
let it
Yeah.
go. Yates. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, for myself, I think meditation is a great, like you've already said, it's a great analogous practice where you're continually practicing coming back from what you thought would be good or what you thought would make sense and just coming back to what's going on, which is often sort of empty and full. Like it's delightful, but it's also not solid.
Sure.
I don't know if that makes sense. But for me, meditation helps the process of writing because I'm less attached to the book that I thought I was writing.
Do you know, I have to tell you, this is okay. So I'd love to talk about this because about 4 years ago, I actually moved away from my long-established daily practice of meditation, in part because I felt that it was absorbing so much of that kind of reckless morning energy, the chaos, that was very useful in the writing. That there were images, there were ideas, all that stuff that needed to get onto the page first. And if I sat down on a cushion and observed it for 20 minutes or an hour or however long I had gotten into a habit of doing, I'd step away from that and be on a too even keel. And the turbulence, and it's
Yeah.
complicated because the turbulence was useful.
Right. That's so interesting. That's been always like I remember William Burroughs. You know William Burroughs?
Sure, sure,
Sure.
sure.
He said to Trunk Rimshay, he said, if I'm going to go on a meditation retreat to some cabin, you're going to be damn sure I'm taking a notebook. You weren't supposed to take anything. He was like,
Right.
I'm definitely taking a notebook because if I have any great thoughts, I'm going to write them down. And Trunk Rimshay said something like, those are the exact thoughts that you need to let go of. And
Right.
the notion was that they don't go away.
Sure.
You actually you're no longer clinging to them. And the whole Woody Allen model of like art, that there has to be neurosis to have great art, is kind of the opposite. There's this great book I should send you if you don't have it, called Dharma Art.
I
You
don't
heard of
know.
that?
No.
Yeah, I'll send that to you.
Yeah, great, thanks.
That art is a kind of like that losing heart thing, when your ego finally gives up.
Sure.
Then you can finally kind of express something genuine that isn't just kind of performance,
Right, sure. Absolutely.
I shouldn't be saying this to you. I mean,
No. But I mean, look. All this stuff is a daily struggle. It's not as though you ever kind of wind up. At least I haven't wound up at a place where, okay, now I get it. Now I can just do it. I'm slaving away at this fourth novel, and believe me, it's harder than the first. And that's a shocker. I'd heard that before, but I didn't believe it. I just simply assumed that the next one would always be easier and easier.
Right. Well, I think, if I may be so ridiculous as to give you advice, my advice would be to maybe, like Pema Chodron or Sakyong Mipam, others will talk about brief periods of meditation in the morning, almost like drinking a double espresso instead of enjoying a pot of tea.
Right.
So, sit down, maybe bow, dedicate yourself to being a benefit, sit for 2 minutes or 5 minutes, just so that you're kind of present instead of caught up in your stuff. Sure. And then, because you're probably right, you're kind of like resolving everything in a 45-minute session. You're kind of...
I don't know about resolving everything. I would...
Yeah, you're fully enlightened by the end of that,
Yeah.
Give you of little books, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe just like a touch of meditation, and also it sounds like your meditation might be more contemplative.
I don't know. That's such a subjective observation that I would be hard pressed to, without knowing, many more details about yours.
To clarify that, so often Buddhists will talk about contemplative meditation, where you're actually going through thoughts and you're actually kind of going through an intellectual process, and then there's like just the straight stuff where you're just kind of coming back from distraction.
Right. Yeah. I would probably say it's a combination. I'll tell you that weekend at Karma Choling 20-some years ago, what was such a revelation to me there.
So just so people understand, you and I, when you were my professor, we drove down with your girlfriend, now wife, or I think we did 2 trips, but we went to this Buddhist meditation center called Karma Choling in Vermont.
Right. Yeah. And so meditation practice was quite new to me then, and I had never done a retreat, and I had never done anything as long as a day-long session that the 2-day-long sessions we were doing there. And so I still remember the terrifying counsel that I've now shared with many people over the years about letting yourself watch your thoughts. I mean, exactly the way you sort of set up the meditation just now. Let yourself watch your thoughts and just label it thinking, then kind of come back to the breath and come back to the present. And that was just like a shocker. and to listen all day to the thoughts racing, and to recognize that you don't have to go chasing them, was the beginning of a great sort of for me step in a different direction, because chasing every thought was a great deal of what my life had been until then.
Right. I mean, all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like being sitting at a cafe and not having to chase every girl or guy who walks by,
Absolutely, of course, exactly. Though, what are those thoughts about, right?
Yeah. Usually short skirts and, Hormones.
Yeah, as I recall, yes.
Yes. I mean, I understand you don't chase any of those thoughts these days. So,
Oh, the thoughts are always, I think,
yeah,
they're
of course.
necessary. Um,
But I
yeah.
think on the other hand, you and I wanted to talk about. I know you hail from the Ukraine, um,
Well,
and
I'm from Jersey. My parents are from Ukraine. Yeah.
there we go. You hail from the Jersey, um, and and often Buddhists, at least in America, in my experience, can, while we're engaged in social action and politics, hopefully on an individual level as a community, we often don't. It's almost like we meditate too much and then don't do any. It's like
Right.
there's almost a positive side that you're expressing and writing about your heritage and about Ukraine, and obviously there's tons of suffering going on there right now. So in a way, it's good to kind of not resolve everything on the meditation cushion and make some noise, right?
Oh, I so agree. I so agree. And again, it's such a complicated thing. I
Yeah.
mean, at the moment, I mean, we have Ukraine, we have Nigeria, we have Gaza, we have, I mean, where in the world can we turn for that place of comfort? Not Tibet, and not Chicago.
Well,
Um,
Boulder's pretty. We're right now the populace of Boulder is upset about fracking and the
yeah,
city of Boulder cutting down trees downtown. So that's the
right,
level of suffering in Boulder. So it's it's not
right,
perfect. Pretty good.
right, right. The relativity of suffering, the obligations that you have toward the community that's immediately around you, and then the one that's kind of beyond your immediate reach, but on which you can have some influence in various ways through direct action where possible, through social media, through writing letters and phone calls. All that I think is profoundly valuable. It's complicated because I understand that spiritual centers wish to be sacred spaces, sanctuaries, if you will, from the stresses and burdens that bedevil us when we're out in the public realm.
Mm,
I read the New York Times every morning, or if I'm trying to get some work done, I usually read it at the end of the day
right.
because pretty much in despair after 20
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
Um, and you realize again, oh, what can I do? And yet, of course, to simply settle on that compassionate thought and not, in fact, act on the several things that can be done in any of the several cases is to undersell yourself because you can, in fact, do a lot individually. Now, I'd love to talk to you about what one can do through centers and organized places because I've had this conversation with people at the different centers I either am involved in or have been involved with.
The
Uh,
Buddhist centers.
Pardon?
The Buddhist centers.
The Kurukula Center here in
Yeah.
Medford, an amazing place. Whoever thought that a medieval Tibetan monastery would appear in Medford, Massachusetts, just a few blocks away from where Paul Revere raced down the street, where Jingle
Yeah.
Bells was written, amazing place. And the Insight Center in Cambridge, where I sometimes go to. They're deliberately places where the conversations around such subjects are limited because who knows what a person's politics are going to be.
Hmm.
How do you
Yeah.
feel
I mean,
about
that's
that?
one thing I personally loved about. I mean, my reference point is Trungpa Rinpoche, really, and right now my bedside book is by him is titled Work, Sex, and Money. And he spends the entire first chapter saying, we're not actually trying to get away from any of this.
Hmm.
We are trying to apply meditation and Dharma to life as it is. And life as it is has wisdom that we can wake up to. Obviously, there is some function of retreat or silence or
Right.
simplifying. We want to take a step back so we can take 2 steps forward with retreat centers.
Right.
But yeah, but we're not trying to get away from it. And I think often various meditative or contemplative communities try and get away from the world, or just people who aren't even religious who just want to go. They're like fed up with the suffering of humanity, and go off to the country and do their
Sure.
thing. But that doesn't work either. Then you wind up, getting engaged in nasty politics with your neighbors about, whatever.
Or with the gophers or the deer who are eating
Exactly.
your
Yeah.
vegetables. And so yeah, no, there's always tension.
Yeah.
Uh, bring that with you, or or is there always tension? Must there be tension? It's interesting because I've been reading two books right now. One about, let's see, what is it called? What Robins Know, by a guy named John Young. That is a kind of primer on learning the language of birds.
Hmm.
And it's sort of underscoring the possibility of a kind of peaceable kingdom inside a natural world that's red in tooth and claw. And then at the same time, I've been reading a book by, I think, what is his name? David Barash. Do you know him at all? He is a psychologist and biologist out in, I think, the University of Washington in Seattle. It's really a fabulous book. It's about Buddhism and biology. And he's he's very empirical and very much grounded in the habits of the scientific mind, and very determined to underscore that kind of struggle in the natural world. And if you look at the kind of larger context in which we are working and living and thinking about local politics and national politics, are we inside a world in which the sort of harmonious existences we'd like to believe in are possible? And what do you think? Is the context?
Well, I think, one of my idols is Yvon Chouinard, who's the founder of Patagonia, which is an imperfect company, but very transparently imperfect. And, they work to be transparent about the whole process of making their clothes, and they try and do everything in an eco-responsible, harmonious way.
Yeah.
And he often says, well, the whole world is totally fucked from a climate change point of view.
Yeah.
All we can do, he studies Zen actually, and he says all we can do is wake up in the morning and work as hard as we can and have as much fun as we can, working as hard as we can, for the benefit of the world. So I don't know if it'll ever be all perfect, but I think individual actions do matter. And I think, like you just wrote about Gaza, I believe, right?
I had written about Gaza in the past, yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess I just read it. So, I think, the more we communicate about that which is in shadows, and the more we try and uplift our own situation, and, as Trungpa Rinpoche always reminded, like, if you're out there protesting but you haven't done your own dishes, like, start at home.
Right.
Create peace at home. And I love that you're talking about caring. I'm actually not caring for my grandmother, who's in the same way. My aunt is doing the daily caring for her. But when I visit my grandma, it's that amazing experience of she's fully there all like 90 years of her amazingness, but she's also not fully there. Yeah. And I think if we're caring for the world just on that individual level, that's quite sweet and powerful. So
sure. But then you're done with the dishes, and there's still a little time, and
you're not get out there,
go out, and so it's possible to do something else. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Gaza, and I think of the waste of human energy that we witness there, and it's sort of why I was asking you about how you see the possibilities for the kind of context in which we live. For instance, I'm a pacifist. I think as a Buddhist, I don't know that one has any choice in the matter, but even if I weren't a Buddhist, I think I'd be a pacifist. And it seems to me a very realistic response to our circumstances and to the struggles in which we engage when we identify with larger entities like nations. I don't know if you know a writer, Nicholson Baker. Have you ever read him? He's got an amazing book called Human Smoke, which is a kind of collage of stories out and around World War II. And it's essentially making a pacifist argument. He's also published a brilliant essay on pacifism in Harper's some years ago. I'll send that to you.
Yeah, great.
But again, he's pointing out how successful pacifist movements have been. And in relation to Gaza, you think that imagine if all the resources that have been spent on killing were spent on building community centers and music centers and art centers and science centers. I mean, You know? Yeah. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just in Israel 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I spent most of my time in Tel Aviv, which is a very kind of liberal. It felt very. Everyone talks about the conflict all the time, very openly. Everyone wants peace that I talked
sure.
with, whatever their politics. Everyone wants peace, and it felt very healthy. And then I went to more conservative. I don't mean to make it black and white in terms of politics, but I went to more conservative areas, and there was much more like I literally was talking. I was at the Dead Sea. We were covered in mud, practically naked. I was talking with this Orthodox Jew, also totally covered in mud. It was a pretty funny sight, and he just offhandedly said something like all. He said something like "fucking Arabs." He was like, "All Arabs are the problem." And then we talked with my other friend Dave, who's a Jewish. We talked. Dave confronted him immediately and said, "What do you mean? Come on. This is happening on both sides. This kind of aggression." And literally within 10 minutes, the guy was like a different person. I don't know if he was just trying to be macho and saying "fucking Arabs," but he
Sure.
he was quite intelligent and really just wanted peace for his children. And so I think you have to. We saw that in the 60s. The 60s were full of problems, but they were also full of civil rights and the beginning maybe of gay rights
Sure.
speeding up a bit, and
Sure.
all kinds of changes happened then. Women's rights.
But it partly happened because of the confrontation, if you will. It partly took place because somebody said, "Okay, let's actually talk about this. I'm not going to let this fly. I'm not going to be polite." And I think that one of the problems is that, look, I live in the liberal Northeast. I've lived for years in the People's Republic of Cambridge. I'm in redneck Medford now. We're around the corner from the birthplace of Lydia Maria Child, who was the first abolitionist writer in America, who was chased out of Medford in the 1820s and had to move to Watertown, Massachusetts, about 5 miles away. So, in a way, I'm speaking out of a very comfortable place, but I've also been in parts of this country where, and in many communities where the feeling is very different. And it's very hard to stand alone inside a community where the prevailing sentiment is against your point of view. And so what your friend did at that moment is again, it's very useful because it led to dialogue. The dialogue led to the possibility of change. Once you kind of skip dialogue and go to fisticuffs.
Yeah. So I mean, my personal, I guess not my personal, my view again from Trungpa Rinpoche is his entire mission. It was like the slogan in everything he did was creating enlightened society. That is always a work in progress, but that it is certainly possible. And I think a lot of writers and a lot of teachers and a lot of silly liberals and a lot of great conservatives have all created peace in their time, and we can certainly. I don't think it's idealistic to say that we can do it. Will we ever get to some idyllic kingdom? Probably not anytime soon, but
I'm with you. I agree. I think that the human possibility is there. And that's why I think it's just so important to have that context. If you believe that it's not, then you've created a situation where where can you go from there? Because you're already inclining to make it not work. So yeah.
I was just talking with friends about, in Huck Finn, where there's the whole feud, the two noble families. They're both portrayed so well by Mark Twain as these beautiful, wonderful families, and they hate each other and they kill each other, but they can't even remember why they started feuding.
Sure. No,
and then at the end they wind up just obliterating each other.
Right. No. I mean, the origins of these arguments go back to Cain and Abel, and I think probably before. At the same time, it's good to remember that you always have the freedom to kind of change the trajectory.
Yeah.
And you need to create an environment in which that's possible.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well, we figured out the whole world.
Isn't that good?
Yeah.
And really, there's nothing left to do except to ask you whether you've ever taken up boxing.
Not formally. Once in a while, I'll drink too much, and no.
That's
No, I've never boxed. I did start climbing a lot, which is different, but
that's much more man against himself,
yeah,
as an
and
approach.
yoga, which is the hardest thing I've ever done.
Yes, I've only tried yoga once. Quite
Yeah, I don't recommend it at all. It's very hard. Yeah. You feel great afterwards, but it's just, especially I think for many men who are not very flexible, it is, it's just an hour and a half to 2 hours of just, feeling like the last 1 minute in a sauna when you can't wait to get out. It's like that for 2 hours, basically.
I'll stick with boxing then.
So you box.
Yeah, I took it up because I took up the cornet, and
Wow.
the cornet required deeper breathing than anything I'd done before had taught me to do, and boxing seemed to be the quickest, most interesting way to get there. But I've always wanted to write an essay about Buddhist boxing, and I haven't quite found the right way in.
Well, we have one essay about, I don't know if it's an essay, but one story about Buddhist boxing on elephants, so I'll send that to you.
Please.
Yeah. It was actually sort of un-Buddhist. It was boxing, and then later the gentleman became Buddhist. So it was about that sort of tension. But that's pretty much like the most quotable thing I think you ever said. That's like very Hemingway sentence. I took up boxing because I was studying the cornet or something.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
That's great. Yeah. So are you still? So you're still teaching actively?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a stack of books I've got to make a selection from, sitting on my table right now, and preparing two courses for the fall. I teach at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, which is a very urban place, and I love, very different from BU, where you and I had met.
Yeah.
This has given me kind of access to the local community, and my students are always humbling me with the worlds that they bring into the classroom, partly because I've taught. I had one of the lost boys of Sudan, now a young man, in one of my classes, somebody who learned to write by writing letters in the sand.
Wow.
And I have, had a Kurdish student who was telling me about the importance of our fighting in the Iraqi war. So it has really kind of brought me into a fascinating sphere. I've got students who work three part-time jobs, to support themselves and often their families.
Wow.
And that's really interesting. And then a very different kind of teaching at Bennington, which is a graduate writing seminar. And that's often professionals who are working on pretty elaborate, sophisticated projects. So, yeah, it's interesting.
So if people are viewing this video and want to connect with you, obviously they can get your books. Is there any place that they can see you, that they can study with you, like at Bennington or? No?
Sure, Bennington or UMass Boston, and I've got the easiest way to reach me directly is through my UMass Boston address, Askold Melnyczuk at umb.edu.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's all spelled helpfully on the video itself. And we'll link to your work on the blog, and I'd love to do this again if you're up for it.
I'd love to, Waylon, and I hope that sometime you must be passing through the East Coast at some point, either New York or Boston. It'd be great to see you in person. You must be going to Carmicholing, no?
Yeah, I went to Carmicholing for the first time actually since pretty much I left 6 months ago, and it was a delight, and mostly a delight. Vermont has been sort of ravaged by, what is it, heroin?
Heroin, yeah, tragically so.
That was shocking. It doesn't quite match with the sort of Norman Rockwell Vermont I knew.
Complex story.
Yeah. So St. Johnsbury, where I went to high school, is just
right,
as beautiful and poor as ever, and but just ravaged by heroin, and it was amazing. And then also Lyme disease has like ravaged the countryside in terms of people being able to live there happily. So that was kind of interesting. And then, yeah, I was in Boston for like 2 days. I should have looked you up, but I'll be there again soon, I'm sure.
Great. Good. Please do. And we'll talk about St. J, because I have similar feelings about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it was weird. All right, Askold Melnyczuk, great to reconnect. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you, teacher.
Yeah. Oh, so as always, you can find us on youtube.com/Waylon H. Lewis or SoundCloud. And again, in our blog on elephantjournal.com, you can search ASKOLD, and you can find all the stuff we'll link to. So, thank you, Askold.
Thank you. Take care. Be well.